Funajima Island, 1612. Sasaki Kojiro stood on the beach at dawn, sword drawn, sweating through his robe. He had arrived on time, with a reputation to defend, students watching from boats offshore, a blade forged for exactly this morning. His opponent was 3 hours late. Miyamoto Musashi was in a rowboat, whittling an oar into a sword with a fisherman's knife, half asleep. When he finally stepped onto the sand, unarmed except for the wooden oar, Kojiro had already lost, not to a technique, but to a man who didn't need the morning to go a certain way. One exchange. Kojiro was dead before his own blade finished its swing. Musashi got back in the boat and rowed off. No applause to wait for. Nobody there he needed to hear it from. Most tellings skip the obvious question this raises. Why does a man about to risk his life show up without a second, without students, without anyone who might carry word of his victory back to a lord who could reward him? By 1612, Musashi had made the decision most people spend their lives avoiding. He belonged to no one. Swordsmanship was the surface. The real story is why a man walked away from every safety net available to him for 40 years, and what that walking built in him. Alone made him what he was. Take it away, and you get someone else entirely. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. Musashi was born around 1584 in Harima province, and the kindest thing you can say about his childhood is that it prepared him for solitude early. His father, Munisai, was a martial arts instructor with a temper that made him hard to live near. Accounts differ on the details, but the pattern holds across every version: distance, not warmth. By his teenage years, Musashi was functionally on his own. At 13, he fought his first duel, answering a traveling swordsman's challenge posted in his town, the standard practice of the era for building reputation off local names. Musashi, a child with no dojo behind him, killed the man with a wooden staff. He had already learned the lesson that would define his life. Nobody was coming to save him if he froze. He was going to live or die on what he alone brought to the fight, and everyone else was, at best, a spectator. Most children who survive something like that spend their adult lives chasing the opposite: a clan, a master, a name that belongs to something larger than them. Musashi went the other direction. If no one was going to be responsible for him, he'd make sure no one got the chance. In 1600, Japan tore itself apart at Sekigahara, deciding who would rule the country for the next 2.5 centuries. Musashi fought for the side that lost. Lords who'd backed the wrong faction were stripped of their lands, and thousands of their retainers were released with nothing: no stipend, no home, no purpose handed down by a superior. Most found a new lord to serve, or spent years petitioning old connections to get back what they'd lost. Musashi did neither. He walked, for years, no fixed home, no guarantee of his next meal, fighting duels for money, for insult, for reasons he never explained. Legend puts his record past 60 duels in this period, including fights against schools that sent students to ambush him afterward. He survived those too. Every one of those duels, Musashi walked into alone. No second, no teacher in the crowd, no clan whose honor would avenge him if he died. If he lost completely, with nobody to soften it. A samurai attached to a household has structure absorbing a bad day, rank and loyalty to cover a poor showing. Musashi had none of that. A win belonged entirely to him. A loss had no household to spread across. He built his reputation on ground with no shelter, which is exactly why the reputation, once it arrived, wasn't borrowed. There's a story of Musashi arriving in a town and finding a dojo that hadn't lost a challenge match in a generation. He didn't ask permission to test himself against them. He walked in, issued the challenge himself, and left with the dojo's reputation in pieces. No lord had sent him. No school had trained him for that match. He simply decided the outcome was worth risking everything on, alone. By his 30s, Musashi wasn't an obscure ronin anymore. He was famous. And fame, in feudal Japan, came with an obvious next step. A lord offering permanent employment. A stipend, a rank, a house, students. The entire structure that every samurai was raised to want. He turned much of it down. This is the part of the story that confuses people who assume solitude only makes sense as a temporary phase, something you endure on the way to security. Musashi had chances at security. Multiple lords wanted him on their payroll, wanted his name attached to their household, wanted to be able to say the greatest swordsman in Japan served them. He accepted some short-term work, some teaching, some strategic advising, but for most of his life, he refused to be owned by any of it. He kept walking. Why would anyone do that? Because Musashi had already noticed something that most people never let themselves notice. A permanent position is also a permanent obligation, and obligation reshapes how honestly you can train, how honestly you can fight, how honestly you can think. Serve a lord, and part of every decision you make gets filtered through what keeps that lord happy. Belong to a school, and part of every technique you develop gets filtered through what that school already teaches. Comfort has a cost, and the cost is paid in the coin of your own edges. Musashi wasn't interested in dulling his. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He wrote, much later, in the text that would come to be called the Dokudo, a line that explains the whole pattern. Accept everything just as it is. Not chase comfort. Not resist reality by trying to control it through other people's protection. Just meet what comes, directly, with nothing standing between him and the outcome. You cannot write a line like that with any honesty if you've spent your life letting other people absorb your risk for you. Skill isn't the only thing 40 years of duels alone should have built in a person. Paranoia would be reasonable. Exhaustion would be reasonable. What Musashi built instead, according to everyone who studied him and everything he left behind, was something closer to the opposite of fear, a kind of stillness that came from having already faced the worst version of every outcome without anyone there to catch him. There's a concept in his later writing, the idea of a mind like still water, unbothered by wind, reflecting exactly what's in front of it without distortion. That's not a technique you learn from a manual. It's what happens to a mind that has stopped needing an audience, stopped performing for a lord's approval or a school's reputation, and has nothing left to manage except the fight actually in front of it. Compare that to the swordsman who trains inside a school, surrounded by classmates, answerable to a master, competing for rank. None of that is wrong. Most people need exactly that structure to develop skill at all. But structure comes with a shadow cost. Part of your attention, in every match, in every practice session, goes toward the social layer. What will my teacher think? What will my rivals say? Did I perform well? Not did I act correctly? Musashi had none of that pulling at him by his 30s. When he stepped onto that beach at Funajima 3 hours late, he wasn't managing an audience of students or worrying about a lord's opinion of his tactics. He had exactly one relationship in that moment, the one between himself and the truth of the fight. Everyone who has ever tried to perform under real pressure knows how rare that is, and how much it changes what a person is capable of. Notice the detail about the lateness again, because it's not a throwaway. Kojiro's students had been waiting on that shore since sunrise. By the time Musashi arrived, the entire crowd was furious, restless, already convinced the outcome would favor their teacher, out of sheer irritation if nothing else. A man who needed that crowd's approval, or feared its judgment, would have felt every second of that weight pressing on him. Musashi felt none of it. He'd spent 3 hours in a rowboat carving a weapon out of an oar, apparently unconcerned with what 300 strangers on the beach thought of his manners. That's not arrogance. That's what happens to a person who has genuinely stopped needing an audience's verdict to know what he's capable of. It would be dishonest to tell this story as though solitude cost Musashi nothing. He is not remembered as a warm man. Accounts describe him as difficult to be around, unconcerned with hygiene for long stretches, blunt to the point of rudeness, uninterested in the small warmths that make a person easy to love. He fathered no children of his own that history records with confidence. He adopted a son, Iori, later in life, and even that relationship reads more like the transmission of a discipline than a family in the ordinary sense. He was, by every account, alone in the way that costs something. Not lonely in the dramatic, tortured sense that gets romanticized in retellings, just alone, structurally, by his own repeated choice, decade after decade, in a culture built entirely around clan, obligation, and belonging. The honest version of this story has to hold both facts at once. Solitude built the stillness, the independence, the refusal to be shaped by anyone else's expectations that made Musashi who he was. It also meant he died without most of what ordinary people call a life. Both things are true. Musashi himself never pretended otherwise. He didn't write the Dokudo as a celebration. He wrote it as a set of hard-won instructions, 21 lines stripped of anything comforting, because comfort was never the point. In his final years, after decades of wandering, after the duels, after his brief service under the Hosokawa clan in Kumamoto, Musashi did something almost nobody expects from a man his age in that era. He didn't retire into a household surrounded by students and grandchildren. He walked into a cave. Reigando, on the outskirts of Kumamoto, became his home for the last stretch of his life. No comfort beyond the basics, no court, no retinue, just a place to sit and think and finally write down what 40 years of being answerable to no one had taught him. In 1643, he completed the Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, a text on strategy that has outlived every lord who ever tried to hire him. In 1645, days before he died, he wrote the Dokudo, 21 lines with no wasted words, the closest thing to a final statement a man like this was ever going to leave behind. He didn't write it for an audience. He wasn't performing wisdom for students gathered at his feet. He was alone in a cave, dying, doing what he'd always done, facing exactly what was in front of him, without anyone there to soften it, without needing anyone there to witness it. Here's where most versions of this story go wrong. They turn Musashi into an argument for isolating yourself, for treating other people as a threat to your discipline, for mistaking coldness for strength. That's not what his life shows, if you look closely. What it shows is narrower and more useful than that. Every time Musashi had a choice between comfort that came with strings and freedom that came with risk, he chose the risk. Not because he hated comfort, because he understood, earlier than most people ever let themselves understand, that comfort quietly rewires what you're willing to say, willing to try, willing to become. A lord's payroll doesn't just buy your loyalty. It buys a small, constant pressure to keep that lord happy, and that pressure shows up in your sword, your decisions, your honesty, whether you notice it or not. You don't have to walk into a cave to apply this. Most people never will, and most people don't need to. But the question underneath Musashi's whole life is one you can ask in an ordinary week. Where have you traded honesty for approval? Where have you softened a decision because someone's opinion of you mattered more than the truth of the situation? Where is there a version of your work, your relationships, your discipline that only exists because you're performing for someone, instead of simply doing the thing correctly? Musashi's answer, over and over, for 40 years, was to walk away from whatever required that performance. Not out of arrogance. Out of the plain observation That a mind managing an audience is a mind that isn't fully present for the fight in front of it, whatever that fight happens to be. He arrived at Funajima 3 hours late, with a sword carved from an oar, and killed a man who had spent his whole life building a reputation Musashi didn't need to answer to. That's not a story about rudeness. That's a story about what happens when a person finally stops needing anyone's permission to be exactly what they are. The cave is still there. Musashi is not. What's left is the choice he kept making, the same one, over and over, for most of his life. Belong to nothing that requires you to be smaller than you are. Face what's in front of you without waiting for someone else to hand you the courage to do it. Walk alone long enough, and you stop needing to be anything other than what the moment actually requires. That's what solitude built in him. Not distance from people. Distance from every reason he might have had to lie to himself. That's the story, for now. If you found it worth your time, subscribing and hitting the bell costs you nothing and helps more than you'd think. Another one's coming tomorrow. Thanks for watching.